A single indigenous community in the mountains of Bataan carries more DNA from an extinct human species than any other population on Earth. A tiny fragment of bone recovered from a cave in northern Luzon turned out to belong to a species of human that science had never documented before. And the majority of Filipinos alive today trace their ancestry to farmers who launched one of the largest population expansions in human history, an expansion that eventually reached from Madagascar to Easter Island. None of that is a coincidence, and none of it happened in a single event. Filipino DNA looks the way it does today because of 5 distinct waves of arrival, spaced across an almost unimaginable span of time, each one leaving a genetic signature that scientists can still read clearly in the population living across the archipelago right now. It's worth being upfront about why this matters beyond simple curiosity. Most countries have a genetic story built around 1 or 2 dominant migration events, a single founding population, or a straightforward colonial history that geneticists can map without too much difficulty. The Philippines breaks that pattern almost completely. Few nations anywhere on Earth carry evidence of an entirely separate, scientifically confirmed hominin species found nowhere else, layered underneath one of the strongest Denisovan genetic signals of a living population, layered underneath a Negrito ancestral lineage, connecting directly to some of the very first modern humans to leave Africa, layered underneath a transformative farming migration that helped launch one of the largest language family expansions in human history, layered underneath several more centuries of well-documented trade and colonial mixing. Understanding these 5 waves individually is really the only way to make sense of why the country's genetic diversity looks the way it does today. The first of these waves reaches back further than anywhere else in the story, and it doesn't even involve modern humans. In 2007, researchers excavating Calao Cave in the Cagayan Valley of northern Luzon recovered a single human foot bone. When they dated it, the result pushed the timeline of human presence in the Philippines back to at least 67,000 years, at the time the oldest confirmed evidence of any hominin ever found in the archipelago. That alone would have been a significant discovery, especially since reaching the Philippines at that point in prehistory would have required crossing open water, given that the archipelago, unlike parts of mainland Southeast Asia during periods of lower sea level, was never fully connected to the continent by a continuous land bridge. What came next made it a genuinely historic one. Over the following decade, further excavation at the same cave turned up additional bone fragments, hand and foot bones, and teeth from at least 3 separate individuals. When researchers examined the anatomy closely, it didn't match Homo sapiens. The toe bones curved in a way more reminiscent of much older, more primitive hominins, while other features, including the shape of the teeth, looked more advanced. In 2019, after years of careful comparative study, the material was formally described as belonging to an entirely new species published in the journal Nature under the name Homolusonensis, the island's own distinct branch of the human family tree. This wasn't an isolated fluke either. Only a few years earlier, researchers working on the Indonesian island of Flores had made a strikingly similar discovery. Another small, previously unknown hominin species, popularly nicknamed the Hobbit, that had apparently survived in isolation on its own island for an extraordinarily long stretch of time. 2 separate, previously undocumented hominin species found on 2 different islands within the same broad Southeast Asian archipelago, both surviving for hundreds of thousands of years in relative isolation before eventually vanishing. That pattern suggests this entire region functioned as something like a natural laboratory for human evolution during the deep Pleistocene, where small populations, cut off from the rest of the world by open water, evolved along their own separate paths, largely undisturbed by contact with other hominins elsewhere on the planet. The comparison between the two species is worth sitting with for a moment because it points to something genuinely remarkable about this specific stretch of islands rather than a coincidence limited to one location. Both Homo floresiensis and Homolusonensis show a mix of primitive and more derived anatomical features that don't cleanly match any previously known hominin lineage, and both were identified specifically because researchers were willing to look closely at skeletal material that, on a more superficial pass, might have simply been assumed to belong to unusually small-bodied modern humans. That willingness to look more carefully has already reshaped scientific understanding of the human family tree twice in this one general region of the world within the span of about 15 years, which raises a genuinely open question about how much more of this deep hominin diversity in island Southeast Asia might still be waiting to be identified in museum collections or unexcavated cave sites across the wider archipelago. Homolusonensis remains a genuine unsolved mystery, and it's likely to stay that way for a while. No usable ancient DNA has yet been successfully extracted from the Callao cave remains because the tropical heat and humidity of the Philippines break down genetic material far faster than the cold, dry conditions that preserved usable DNA from comparable age sites in Siberia and Europe. Researchers are working entirely from bone anatomy rather than genetic sequencing, which means the deepest question, exactly how Homolusonensis relates to other archaic human species and whether it connects in any way to a genetic mystery that shows up much later in this same story, remains open. Some researchers studying the wider pattern of unusually high Denisovan ancestry and unusual hominin diversity across this specific region of island Southeast Asia have speculated cautiously that Homolusonensis itself might even connect in some way to the broader Denisovan story, given how little is still known about exactly how many distinct archaic human populations were moving through and adapting to this specific stretch of islands during this period. That connection remains genuinely speculative rather than established fact, but it's a real active area of ongoing research precisely because this region keeps turning up more hominin diversity than researchers expected to find in any single, relatively confined geographic area. What isn't in question is the basic fact this first wave establishes. Something recognizably human was already living in the Philippines an extraordinarily long time before anything resembling the population living there today ever arrived. The second wave is the one that actually connects to the ancestors of people living in the Philippines right now, and it's where the story shifts from a single mysterious species to the deep roots of an entire population still present in the archipelago today. Sometime after Homolusonensis, and likely tens of thousands of years before recorded history, modern Homo sapiens reached the Philippines as part of a much broader migration spreading along the southern coastline of Asia. The same broad movement of people that also gave rise to the ancestors of Papuan populations in New Guinea and Aboriginal populations in Australia. This coastal migration route is one of the best documented early chapters of the human story outside Africa, tracing a path along the shoreline of South Asia and into Southeast Asia, with different branches peeling off along the way to settle different islands and coastlines as they went. The Philippines representing one of the northernmost points this particular branch of the migration reached. The most direct living descendants of this early wave are the various groups collectively known as Negritos, more than 24 distinct ethnic communities scattered across the Philippines today, going by names including Aita, Agta, Ati, and Aita, each with its own language and cultural traditions, but sharing a broadly similar deep ancestry and a set of characteristic physical traits, including smaller average stature and tightly curled hair. that set them apart from later arriving populations elsewhere in the archipelago. These communities today live across a wide geographic spread from the mountains of northern Luzon down through the central Visayas and into parts of Mindanao, a distribution that itself reflects how widely this early population once ranged across the archipelago before later migrations reshaped the demographic map of the islands. Genetic studies comparing Philippine Negrito populations against Papuan and Aboriginal Australian populations confirm this deep shared connection clearly, showing genetic signatures pointing back to a common ancestral migration, despite these populations being separated today by thousands of kilometers of ocean and tens of thousands of years of independent history. Each group subsequently developed its own distinct genetic profile through isolation and local adaptation, but the underlying thread connecting them back to that same early coastal migration route out of Africa remains clearly detectable in the genetic record today. This is the wave that explains why Negrito communities in the Philippines carry genetic ancestry deep enough to predate almost everything else discussed in the rest of this story. A population whose roots in these specific islands reach back tens of thousands of years before the ancestors of most other Filipinos ever arrived. The third wave isn't really a migration in the traditional sense at all. It's a genetic encounter, and it produced one of the most surprising findings in the entire recent history of Philippine population genetics. In 2021, a research team led by geneticists at Uppsala University, working with more than 100 ethnic groups across the Philippines and analyzing roughly 2.3 million genetic markers per individual, discovered that a specific indigenous community, the Aita Magbucon of Bataan Province, carries more Denisovan ancestry than any other population ever tested anywhere on the planet, more than the Papuan Highlanders, who had previously held the record, more than any population in Australia. Roughly 5% of their genome traces back to Denisovans, a close cousin species to Neanderthals, known to science mostly through a handful of bone fragments recovered from a single Siberian cave, first recognized as a distinct branch of the human family tree only within the last 15 years or so. Before this study, the working assumption in the field was that Papuan Highlanders and Aboriginal Australians represented something close to a ceiling for how much Denisovan ancestry any living human population could plausibly carry. The Aita Magbucon result overturned that assumption almost immediately, and the explanation behind this record isn't that the Aita Magbucon had more contact with Denisovans than anyone else. It's that they had less contact later on with a very different population, East Asian-related migrants who arrived in the Philippines thousands of years afterward, carrying essentially no Denisovan ancestry of their own. Most other Philippine Negrito groups mixed more extensively with these later arrivals, diluting their original Denisovan signal in the process. The Aita Magbucon, isolated in the mountains of Bataan, mixed with these later migrants far less than their neighbors, estimated at somewhere between 10 and 30% compared to much higher levels of mixing in most other Negrito populations, and when researchers mathematically stripped away that later admixture to isolate what remained, the underlying Denisovan signal turned out to be roughly 30 to 40% stronger than in Papuan Highlanders or Aboriginal Australians. Researchers also determined this likely represents an entirely separate, independent admixture event between ancestral Negrito populations and Denisovans, distinct from the interbreeding event responsible for Denisovan ancestry in Papua New Guinea and Australia, meaning modern humans crossed paths with Denisovan populations more than once, in more than one place, as both groups moved through this region of the world during roughly the same broad stretch of prehistory. That distinction matters scientifically, because it suggests Denisovans themselves were considerably more widespread and genetically diverse across island Southeast Asia than researchers assumed even a few years earlier, encountering and mixing with different modern human groups independently rather than through a single shared contact event that later spread outward to every Australasian population at once. That third wave is really about timing and dilution as much as it is about the ancient contact event itself, and it sets up exactly why the fourth wave matters so much to the overall genetic picture of the Philippines today. Because the fourth wave is the one that diluted that ancient Denisovan signal across most of the archipelago in the first place, and it's the single largest, most consequential migration in this entire five-part story in terms of its lasting genetic footprint. Starting roughly 4,000 years ago, farming populations speaking early Austronesian languages began spreading outward from a homeland most linguists and archaeologists place in Taiwan. They moved south through the Philippines first, and then, over the following 2,000 to 3,000 years, continued outward across an almost unimaginably vast stretch of ocean, eventually reaching Madagascar off the coast of Africa in one direction, and Hawaii and Easter Island in the remote Pacific in the other, making Austronesian one of the most widely dispersed language families to ever exist on Earth. The scale of that expansion is genuinely difficult to overstate, and the Philippines sat at one of its earliest and most important waypoints. These early Austronesian communities brought rice and other crop cultivation, distinctive pottery traditions, and increasingly sophisticated open ocean navigation and boat-building skills that let them island hop across enormous stretches of water in outrigger canoes, long before anyone had the navigational instruments later European explorers would eventually rely on. Archaeological evidence of this expansion shows up across the Philippines in distinctive red-slipped pottery styles, and somewhat later in extensive jade ornament trade networks connecting the islands to Taiwan and Vietnam, clear evidence of sustained maritime contact and cultural exchange across the region for centuries following the initial settlement. When these Austronesian-speaking farmers reached the Philippines, they encountered the descendants of those much earlier Negrito populations already living there, and the genetic record shows a pattern of gradual mixing between the two groups over the following centuries, producing exactly the kind of blended ancestry that defines most of the ethno-linguistic groups making up the majority Filipino population today, sometimes called the Malayo-Polynesian-speaking majority, distinct from but genetically connected to the Negrito minority populations whose ancestors had already been living in the archipelago for tens of thousands of years by the time these migrants arrived. Researchers have even pinned down roughly when the major share of that mixing occurred, using genetic dating methods that measure how thoroughly different chromosome segments have broken apart and recombined across generations. Approximately 2,281 years ago, a date that lines up closely with the archaeologically documented spread of Austronesian farming culture through the region. That mixing event is exactly what diluted the Denisovan signal in most Philippine Negrito groups, and it's also exactly what produced the broad genetic profile carried by the majority of Filipinos alive today, closely related to populations in Taiwan and elsewhere in maritime Southeast Asia, layered on top of a smaller but still measurable contribution from the earlier, deeper Negrito and Denisovan admixed lineages already present in the islands. The fifth and final wave doesn't come from a single migration at all, but from several more recent, well-documented episodes of contact and mixing layered on top of everything that came before, each smaller individually than the Austronesian migration, but still leaving a genuinely traceable genetic mark on specific communities and regions. Long-distance trade contact with Chinese merchants, predating European colonization by many centuries, left a measurable genetic imprint in coastal trading communities, particularly around Manila and other major historical port cities, reinforced by further waves of Chinese immigration during and after the Spanish colonial period. This Chinese mestizo heritage, as it's often described in Philippine historical and social terminology, became especially significant among specific merchant families across the central Philippines, and its genetic legacy remains clearly traceable in these communities today, distinct in measurable ways from populations with less historical trade contact. More than 3 centuries of Spanish colonial rule, beginning in the 16th century, introduced a smaller but still genetically detectable European contribution, concentrated especially in families and regions with a documented history of Spanish colonial administrative or commercial presence, though this contribution remains, on average, considerably smaller than the much larger East Asian and Austronesian-derived foundation, running through the majority of the population nationally. Genetic studies looking specifically at this European contribution have generally found it concentrated in a relatively modest percentage of the overall population genome on average nationally, though with considerably higher concentrations in specific families with documented Spanish colonial-era ancestry, particularly among some of the historically prominent landowning families whose lineage traces directly back to Spanish colonial administrators and settlers. American colonial administration following the Spanish-American War added its own smaller cultural and genetic layer afterward, alongside continued regional migration and intermarriage between different Filipino ethno-linguistic groups, a process that has only accelerated with modern transportation and the country's large-scale internal migration in more recent decades. The Philippines' status today as one of the world's largest sources of international labor migration adds a still unfolding chapter to this same fifth wave, with millions of Filipino workers living and forming families abroad, across the Middle East, North America, Europe, and elsewhere, creating an increasingly large global diaspora whose genetic story continues layering onto an already remarkably complex ancestral foundation, adding new international mixing with every subsequent generation. Put these 5 waves together, and you get a genuinely coherent explanation for why Filipino DNA looks so different, not just from other populations around the world, but from region to region and community to community within the Philippines itself. A large-scale genetic survey analyzing data from more than 2,000 individuals across dozens of ethnic groups found that the Philippines carries a level of genetic diversity researchers describe as remarkable for a single country of its size, a direct consequence of this layered migration history playing out across more than 7,000 separate islands. That geographic fragmentation matters enormously for how this diversity developed and persisted. Populations settling on different islands or in different isolated mountain and coastal regions, even within the same island, often had limited contact with each other for centuries at a time, allowing distinct regional genetic and linguistic profiles to develop and persist in a way a more geographically continuous landmass simply wouldn't have preserved as clearly. The Philippines' more than 7,000 islands spread across a north-south distance of well over 1,000 miles created exactly the kind of natural laboratory for genetic and linguistic divergence that researchers find in island archipelagos elsewhere in the world, from Indonesia to the Pacific Islands. Communities separated by even a relatively narrow channel of water without reliable regular boat travel connecting them could easily go many generations with minimal direct genetic exchange, allowing small differences in ancestry accumulated through slightly different combinations of these 5 waves to persist and even sharpen over time rather than blending back into a single national average. This is a large part of why the Philippines today recognizes well over 100 distinct ethno-linguistic groups, each carrying its own specific traceable combination of these 5 ancestral layers. That regional variation is worth spelling out in more concrete terms because a single national average genuinely obscures more than it reveals here. Populations in the Cordillera mountain region of northern Luzon carry a genetic profile shaped heavily by relative isolation and by specific patterns of early Austronesian settlement in that mountainous terrain, distinct in measurable ways from populations in the more accessible, more heavily trafficked coastal regions of the central and southern Philippines, which show comparatively greater genetic input from later waves of trade-driven and colonial-era mixing. Populations across Mindanao and the Sulu archipelago add yet another distinct layer, reflecting centuries of additional historical contact with maritime Southeast Asian sultanates and the broader Malay world, producing genetic and cultural profiles measurably distinct from populations in Luzon and the Visayas, even while sharing that same deep underlying Austronesian and Negrito ancestral foundation. And Negrito populations themselves aren't a single genetically uniform group either, despite frequently being discussed that way. The specific proportion of deep ancestral pre-Austronesian genetic material and the specific proportion of later admixture varies measurably from one Negrito community to the next, exactly the variation that allowed researchers to identify the Aita Magbucon specifically as carrying an unusually undiluted signal compared to their neighboring Negrito communities elsewhere in the archipelago. All of this genetic complexity carries real, practical weight beyond simply satisfying historical curiosity. Understanding the specific genetic makeup of different Filipino populations has direct relevance for medical research and healthcare, since disease risk factors, drug metabolism patterns, and other health-related genetic traits can vary meaningfully between populations with different ancestral histories and different levels of genetic diversity. Much of the foundational research underlying modern precision medicine has historically drawn overwhelmingly on genetic data from European and East Asian populations, with Southeast Asian populations and Philippine populations specifically remaining considerably underrepresented in large genomic databases relative to their actual genetic diversity. Large-scale studies like the one that identified the Aita Magbucon's record-breaking Denisovan ancestry serve a dual purpose in this respect, answering genuinely fascinating questions about deep human history while simultaneously building exactly the kind of population-specific genomic reference data that future medical research and healthcare policy in the Philippines will need to draw on, filling a gap in the global genomic research record that has real consequences for how effectively medical science can serve a population this genetically distinct and this internally varied. This gap matters more than it might initially seem because a country carrying 5 distinct ancestral layers, this well-documented, is exactly the kind of population where a one-size-fits-all approach to genetic medicine is most likely to fall short. A treatment protocol or risk calculation built primarily on European genetic data may simply not transfer accurately to a population whose genome carries such a different combination of ancient and recent ancestral inputs, and researchers working specifically with Filipino and broader Southeast Asian genomic data have increasingly emphasized closing that gap as a priority, both for the scientific value of better understanding human genetic diversity broadly, and for the very practical goal of making sure medical research keeps pace with exactly how genetically layered a population like this one actually is. Stepping back from the individual details, what these 5 waves add up to is a population built from repeated cycles of arrival isolation and gradual mixing, stretched across a span of time that starts with an entirely separate extinct human species and ends with a modern global diaspora still actively reshaping the country's genetic story today. An unresolved mystery hominin, quite possibly unique to a single island. The deep, tens of thousands of years old ancestry of the Negrito peoples, connecting the Philippines to the same ancient migration that produced Papuan and Aboriginal Australian populations. A genuinely rare, still only partially understood ancient encounter with Denisovans, preserved most clearly today in a single, relatively isolated community. A transformative farming migration out of Taiwan, roughly 4,000 years ago that reshaped the genetic majority of the entire archipelago and went on to help populate a significant share of the Pacific and Indian Ocean worlds. And centuries of additional trade, colonial, and modern global migration layered on top of all of it. 5 waves, 5 entirely different timescales, and one population carrying the genetic trace of every single one of them, still visible today in the DNA of specific communities scattered across more than 7,000 islands. It's worth pausing on just how unusual it is for a single country to hold this much documented genetic depth within its borders. Most nations, even genuinely old and genuinely diverse ones, tend to have a dominant narrative built around 1 or 2 major ancestral population movements. Very few places on the planet can point to a genetic record with 5 clearly distinguishable waves this well documented, spanning a range from an entirely separate hominin species tens of thousands of years before modern humans arrived, to a still ongoing wave of international labor migration reshaping the country's genetic story in real time today. This kind of research also continues evolving quickly, which is worth keeping in mind given how much has already changed in just the last 2 decades. The Callao cave excavations that eventually led to the identification of Homolusonensis only began in the early 2000s. The genomic study identifying the Aita Magbukon's record-breaking Denisovan ancestry was published as recently as 2021, built on sequencing technology and analytical methods that simply didn't exist even a decade or 2 earlier. Each of these 5 waves has been confirmed through patient, methodical, scientific work rather than any single dramatic breakthrough, and it's a near certainty that further research in the coming years will add still more detail and nuance to a picture that's already considerably more intricate than most popular accounts of Philippine history have ever captured. None of this required a single dramatic origin story to explain it, and in some ways, that's exactly the point worth taking away. The honest answer to why Filipino DNA looks the way it does was never going to be simple, because the actual history behind it was never simple either. It's a genetic record built in layers, each wave leaving something behind that the next wave built on top of rather than erased, and the result is a population whose genome carries genuine traceable echoes of nearly every major chapter in the story of how humans, and at least one other, still mysterious branch of the human family tree, came to spread across this part of the world in the first place. 5 migrations, 5 distinct timescales, and a single, remarkably layered population still carrying the genetic signature of every one of them today.